Good day. Today we're going to discuss a very interesting topic in our next discussion: why Christianity needs to change or totally just disappear. This topic is probably very problematic for most fundamentalist Christians or Christians that think they know everything about the Bible. So there's a big surprise for you today. A couple of Sundays ago, I asked a question in our worship service: why is it that Jesus so closely followed John the Baptist? They were cousins, and one would think it's because of the family ties that Jesus followed John and went down to the river Jordan and kind of get baptized by John. And by doing that, he gave John legitimacy, came to him and said, "Well, I hear what you are saying. You are called the voice in the desert and or in the wilderness, and I agree with you." Jesus wouldn't have been baptized by John the Baptist if he didn't agree with him. So that is the question. So why was that Jesus felt so closely related, except for the family ties, so closely related to what John was teaching? It's a very interesting topic because it takes us back to a certain group of people that we do not know a lot of during the time of Jesus. There were three distinct groups within Judaism at the time. We all know the Pharisees, and we all know how Jesus really bumped heads with them. He were at odds with them. He didn't agree with them, and he didn't shy away. He told them straight away what he thought of them. And then there was a second group, the Sadducee, which we do not really know a lot about, but if you read the texts, it seems as the elite. You know, they would mix with the rich people, the people with influence. So their teachings were not as profound and didn't have such a big impact as the Pharisee. Then there was a third group, which we do not really know a lot about, being Christians, although there is a lot of said about them in the New Testament. We just don't read it that way. And this third group is the Essenes. Now, we get to know the Essenes especially through the discoveries in 1946 at the caves at a little town called Qumran, which was close to the Dead Sea. Between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, there was this community, and the people there were known as the Essenes. They were also destroyed in 70 after Christ when the Romans destroyed the Maccabean revolt and killed 1.1 million Judean people during those days. It was a hectic war, and it kind of wiped the Judean people off the map, which is also interesting because suddenly we have all these Jews across the world. Where do they really come from if the Romans kind of wiped them out in 70 after Christ? That is another question we will look into in the future. But for today, it's important to know that the Essenes, and you can go and read the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a combination of a lot of fragments of scriptures that were written by the Essenes in the Qumran community. But the Essenes had three major centers across the world in those days. So the most important and the biggest one, I would say, was the Essenes, and they were at Qumran, as we said. Then there was a second group that was in Egypt. They were called the Theraputai, and they were in Egypt, and they were also a Judaistic sect. And it is interesting that when Jesus and his parents fled King Herod as an infant, they went to Egypt. And it is believed that they went to this group of Judaistic or Judean people that lived in Egypt, the Theraputai, which was part of the Essenes of Israel. Then there were a third group. Now, this is the most important group for us as Christians. They lived at the Mount Carmel to the north of Jerusalem, and they were known as the, listen carefully, Nazarenes. Now, people would say, and you get this in the book of Acts, chapter 2, verse 22, it says Jesus was a Nazarene. In the book of Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verse 23, it says Jesus was a Nazarene. But this verse is very problematic because later on in the verse it says he lived in a town called Nazareth. So Christians just said, oh yeah, he's a Nazarene because he came from the town of Nazareth, which is not true because the town of Nazareth, listen carefully, the town called Nazareth did not exist in the time of the birth of Jesus Christ. It is a town that came into being many years after his birth. When Jesus was born, Nazareth did not exist. So Jesus could not have been from Nazareth. Although every Christmas we say Mary and her husband Joseph went from Nazareth to Bethlehem to be counted in the accounting of the nation, and which is all nonsense, because the town of Nazareth didn't exist. There's no archaeological findings to prove that this town existed. Eusebius, which is an early Christian writer in the time of the Romans, wrote extensively about the region where Jesus walked, where he did his work, and he also never mentioned the town of Nazareth. He also didn't say anything of Jesus being from Nazareth, and therefore he was called the Nazarene. No, Jesus was called the Nazarene because he was part of these three groups of Essenes. The one group in Qumran, the one group at the Mount Carmel, which were called the Nazarenes specifically, and then the other group in Egypt. Now, these Essene people, or mostly men, because in those days the Judaistic faith were more or less driven by men, as you by now know. And this group of people separated themselves from the temple in Jerusalem because they believed that the new high priest, who was not a Zadok priest, brought a lot of new things into the temple that was not right. Interestingly, the Essenes, including the Therapeutae in Egypt and the Nazarenes to the north of Jerusalem, all three these groups were well known, they were not in favor of the sacrifice of animals. They were vegetarian, they did not eat animal flesh, and the third distinct character of these three groups were that they set into a more spiritual teaching of the Judaistic faith and the Torah. So they came about and said, we need to be spiritual healers. And therefore, they had a total different point of view than the Pharisee and the Sadducee and the scribes. Now, Jesus being part of this group, and there's no question about this, we find it also in the book of Acts, where it is specifically said that Jesus was a Nazarene. We find it in the book of Acts, chapter 2, verse 22, where it specifically says Jesus was a Nazarene. We find it also in chapter 23 of the book of Acts, where it's the story about what happened to Paul, which said they caught this man, meaning Paul. He was really not a good guy because he was the ringleader or one of the leaders of the Nazarene. So Paul also in later years, although he started out to be a Pharisee, switched sides probably after his Damascus Road experience, and he became a follower of this group of Essenes who found themselves in Nazarene. Paul also distinctively separated himself from the other disciples, and he never visited them in Jerusalem, although he could have, but he never did it. So he rather went to the Nazarene group, and he was also taught by them the same way than Jesus was. So this is profound for our thinking and our knowledge about this person, Jesus, which we as Christians follow. We can start to understand the teachings of Jesus through his miracles and through his healings, because these things are spiritual stuff within the Gospels, and that is the stuff that the teachings of the Essenes were made of. They were focused on the spiritual side. They were far more strict than the Pharisee. They did not tolerate any nonsense, and they said people need to separate themselves from these traditional Judaistic faith and laws and go into this to become a holy temple. That's where the idea comes from, that this body is the temple of God and the Spirit of God is within this body. That is an Essene teaching, and that is what Jesus brought, and that is what Paul takes further, and that is what they taught about who we are and where we are going with these bodies. So that's a couple of interesting notes, just very briefly. We will look into this in the coming weeks. What does it mean for us as Christians? How can we learn more about what Jesus said, what he taught? Remember, he taught all his stuff in parables, which is also the way the Essenes did it, by the way. They didn't tell the story straight away. They brought it in a parable form. They saw their miracles and their healings as a parable, not so much about the miracle or the healing, but so much more about the message that's within that. And the message within that was about the healing of us as people, so that we can understand that we are spiritual beings having a human experience within this human body. So that is Jesus the Essene, because he was called Jesus, not from Nazareth, because Nazareth, as I said, didn't exist, but he was called Jesus the Nazarene. And this is proved from the Bible. This is not something that I think out or think it's cool to talk about this, but this you can find in the scriptures, and I've given you some of the texts where you can find it and read it. The problem is with the translations in later years, this term Nazarene was changed to mean that Jesus was from Nazareth, and we now know that town didn't exist. It couldn't have been. It should have mean something else, and what it meant was Jesus was part of the group of the Essenes. So next week we're going to start and look at what was the specific teachings of the Essenes, because we find it also in the teachings of John the Baptist, who was part of the Essene group in the Qumran community. That's why Jesus went down to the Jordan, which was close to the Qumran community, and that's where he met his cousin John. So they were part of the same bigger group, but they belonged to two smaller groups, Jesus to the Nazarenes and John to the specific Essenes at Qumran. Very interesting. So keep on following. We're going to discuss this in deeper detail and learn more about this man, Jesus, that we follow as Christians. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.